The story of the three kings in Matthew's Gospel has captured the imagination of people for centuries. Not just the mystery of who they were and what they were, but also what do they teach us? What can we learn from them? So in this sermon today we're going to be looking at the three kings. You may want to press pause and read Matthew 2 verses 1 to 12 right now. In order to understand a little bit more about the three kings, I want us to think about this 4-point structure, which is rumors, signs, pursue, and worship. First of all, Matthew is quoting from the book of Micah. Now, Micah was writing 700 years before the time of Jesus. He was around the same time as Isaiah, and he prophesied that the ruler would come out of Israel, out of Bethlehem. This is what he wrote. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler, and he will shepherd my people Israel. By the time we get to Jesus, not only were the books of the Old Testament set in stone as the canon of what we call the Old Testament, but also the understanding that the Messiah would come, a future person who would come from Bethlehem, was well established. Nearly all people in that region would have been familiar with the concept of Messiah. Now, one of the groups of people who would have been also aware of this prophecy were the wise men. Now, the term wise men is a later translation. The word actually to describe them, or to describe what they were, is actually a Persian word, which is the word magi. Now, funny enough, that's where we get the word magic from. And there has been some debate over the years concerning the translation of the word. Some felt that, should we call them astronomers? Should we call them astrologers? But they felt that not only did they read stars and signs, but the description of what they were really goes beyond that. Some said, should we just call them scholars or academics? So they eventually came up with the term wise men, which is sort of the best way to describe them, really. And who were they? Well, our first clue is that the very word magi is a Persian word. So we know that the wise men came from Persia, because it says that wise men came from the east. Now, presumably Matthew was writing in the region of Jerusalem, so he's referring to the east there. But some of the descriptions we know about them doesn't actually come from the Bible. One classic example is that we get this idea that there were three of them, only three of them, because they brought three gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But from what we know of history, travelers like this came in caravans, basically. This was a huge group of people traveling to come from the east all the way to Jerusalem. Some speculate there could have been as many as 100 or more. So we really have to get our heads out of this idea that there was only three of them. Another misunderstanding is that they were kings, we three kings we sing about. Now we know that the Magi weren't kings, but they did instruct kings. They did give them wisdom and interpret dreams for them. Now it's very likely that these wise men came from the area of Babylon, Persia, and that actually their influence would have come from the prophet Daniel. He too, if you remember in the book of Daniel, he too was sent to Babylon from Jerusalem, and he was a magi. He ended up being the chief magi because he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So I find it very interesting that a prophecy of a Jewish Messiah from a Gentile nation came from a Jewish man who was sent to this Gentile nation. It's also very likely that the wise men were Zoroastrians from the religion Zoroastrianism. It's a very old religion. It too also comes from the Babylonian area at the time of the exile when the Jews were sent there. It focuses on one god, and its key symbol was fire. The fire that they light never goes out. Now, interestingly enough, the Zoroastrians also had their own prophecies about a Messiah, a king of the Jews who would be born one day. Now we go to the second point, which is the sign. God had now provided a physical sign for them in the sky, which was the star. Now, there is some great deal of speculation as to what this star was. All the text says is that it's a star. There's a very interesting verse. First, verse 2. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Then verse 9, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now there's an interesting distinction there between the star rising and going on ahead of them and then stopping at its place. Now, there's some, as I said, there's some speculation. Some say that it was a cluster of stars that formed the ram Aries. Others people say that it was an angel. One of the most likely explanations, which probably does have some weight to it, is that it was actually a planet. Could have been the planet Jupiter, because from what I understand, stars in space don't actually move. They're sort of set in place, whereas a planet does rotate and does move around the solar system. So it could be that God used the natural science of the planet Jupiter to allow the wise men to follow it. Or it could be that God stepped into creation, as it were, and sort of physically moved the stars. Depends on which way you interpret the miracle. But no matter which way you read it, we're basically talking about a sign that was made visible that allowed the wise men to follow it to the Christ child. So we have this idea here of God leading them to the right place by using signs and wonders. Now, it is very interesting that God chose to communicate to these wise men in ways that they understood, in the customs that they were used to. For example, we know that God first of all used a star, and we know that these wise men were expert at interpreting the sky and interpreting the stars. We also read later in the story that he communicated to them in a dream. Now, Magi were also experts at interpreting dreams. So isn't that very interesting that God communicated to them in ways that they understood fully? And that got me thinking, does God communicate to us in that way? Ways that we are familiar with. We know that God could communicate through art, poetry, film, creation. He always communicates in ways that we can relate to. We come then to the third point, which is pursue. After having the understanding of the rumours of the Messiah, that background knowledge, and now seeing the physical sign, they now pursue the journey, they pursue the sign. What is very interesting about these wise men is that we also have to get out of our head that they saw Jesus as a baby or as a newborn. Actually, in reality, Jesus would have been 7 or 8 months at this point, because if they're from Persia and they travel all the way to Jerusalem, we don't know what route exactly they would have taken, but we do know it would have taken them months. And it's probably likely that this happened in the summer. So you're thinking now of a journey through the Arabian desert in the summer. So every Christmas card that we see with the newborn Jesus, in reality, Jesus would have been a couple of months old at this point. Jesus only would have been a newborn when the shepherds came to see him. And by the time Mary and Joseph got to Egypt, he would have been a toddler by that point. So again, all these ideas come from tradition, not from the Bible itself. It is also worth considering that this journey had its dangers. For example, when Herod heard that this new king was born, this new king of the Jews, because see, at that time, he was given the authority by Caesar to rule that region, and so technically he was the king of the Jews. So all of a sudden, when this rumour had come up, another rumour, that this boy had been born who was going to be king of the Jews, this gave Herod alarm bells. Now, from what we know of Herod, he was a very paranoid person. He married 10 wives. I think he had one of them killed. He had some of his children put to death. He was a really horrible man. And he does something very cunning. He works in a very sneaky way. He basically told the Magi to come to him and find out where this child was born so I may go and worship him. But we know full well he had no intention of worshipping Jesus. He just wanted the information so he could then assassinate Jesus. So he used the wise men to his advantage. And then we read later that there was great devastation when he put all the baby boys to death. The fourth point then is worship. After the long journey and after the danger of encountering Herod, they finally come to the Christ child. And it's amazing that the star actually took them directly to the house. It's almost as if the star first of all gave them general direction, and then it gets very specific, taking them to the actual house where Mary and Joseph were staying. And we see that in the narrative they give them 3 gifts: gold, frankincense and myrrh. Now there has been some speculation again, why these gifts, did they sort of represent something? Some interpret this in a more spiritual sense and others in a more practical sense. The spiritual application would be that gold is a very precious metal, and it would sort of represent Jesus as king and royalty, kings. The frankincense would sort of represent worship, the incense, And myrrh actually could represent the death of Christ. You'll remember that he was offered myrrh and wine when he was on the cross. So there could be some foreshadowing there. But another interpretation, which is more on the practical side, would be that perhaps they used the gold to buy things, to provide for themselves, to make the journey to Egypt. Again, perhaps frankincense was used to give worship to God. And also myrrh could have been used for medicine. Perhaps they needed to treat some wounds for themselves. So perhaps the gifts do have some significance. But myrrh and frankincense is tree sap, and it only grows in certain regions of the world, which is where, again, the wise men would have come from. So from these clues, we can sort of piece together where they came from. We read in the text then that the wise men was warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, but they returned home by a different route. Now that's interesting that they went home, and you have to imagine now going back to that sort of Zoroastrian life, that they now have a different gospel. They now have the truth of the gospel from Christ, and that they're going to take that home with them and share it with the rest of their community. So, in saying all that, when we go back to that 4-point sermon of rumors, sign, pursue, and worship, what would this mean for us? Well, I think for a lot of people, there are rumors going round about Jesus, Christianity. Perhaps some people have an idea of the Bible or of church from movies or from popular culture. So there is that sort of background knowledge. The second point then is the sign. And I just wonder, does God give us signs all the time in our life? Signs that are approachable, signs that relate to us. And then the third point, pursue, is the idea of, are we going to pursue those signs? Are we going to pursue the revelation that God has given us? Are we going to follow through with it? Even though it may have its dangers and its oppositions, like Herod, what are the oppositions that you may encounter as you go about your Christian life or want to embrace the Christian life? And then the last point, worship, is then coming to that realization of coming to Christ, surrendering your life to him, giving your life over to the newborn King. We too then share the gospel in our community. We don't just keep it stored up, we take it out into the community.